It was neither peace nor war, with constant communist probing and Western countermeasures, a worldwide struggle of pathological hostility as each side saw the other as the incarnation of evil. The Cold War, this time on the Western tradition. The year 1945 was the end of a period and also of a way of life. The Second World War had shaken the globe like a great earthquake, and nothing after it was going to be the same again. The age of European dominance was over. The supremacy of European countries, based as much on prestige as on power, could not survive the blow it had received. But the great European colonial empires had already been sapped in earlier years by declining confidence among the masters and ever more strident appeals to the liberal doctrines that the masters taught. Now these empires quickly fell to pieces when the economic and military power that had won them, that had held them, disappeared. The sun, when it sets, goes quietly. The confidence that made Europeans shoulder the white man's burden uninvited broke down. The war had shown that the seats of power now lay outside Europe. They lay with Europe's two great offspring, the Soviet Union and the United States. And with these new centers of power, there came a new rivalry that has dominated the world ever since. The first international act after the war was to create a new organization, the United Nations, all 159 of them, to replace the League of Nations, discredited as an ineffective talking shop. The structure of the United Nations was designed to balance the interests of the great powers, which had won the war, against those of other weaker nations. The United Nations did not prove vastly more effective than its predecessor in avoiding conflicts. It too was a talking shop. But talking is better than fighting. The primary reason why the talk never degenerated into global war was the balance of terror. A new factor which we now regard or disregard as an old familiar factor. America, remember, had demonstrated the incredible power of the atom bomb in 1945. By 1949, the Soviets had a bomb of their own, in spite of a prediction by US Army intelligence that they wouldn't be able to build one for a whole generation. Within a few years, both the United States and Russia had hydrogen bombs as well, vastly more powerful and more deadly than the old atom bombs. And by 1957, the Soviets could also put a satellite into orbit, the implications of which were not lost on the West. An intercontinental ballistic missile that could carry Sputnik could also carry atomic warheads to the United States and to Western Europe. Paradoxically, this threat of mutually assured destruction, as it was eventually known, this threat made a lot of people very nervous and forced the atomic nations to use their power with relative caution. The risk of an atomic blow-up did not prevent other conflicts, but it did keep them within limits. And as a result, the years since 1945 were full of crises and of conflict, but none of these has yet degenerated into the sort of general war that devastated Europe and much of the rest of the world in the two world wars. If it does, we probably won't be here to talk about it. But in the last year of World War II, it wasn't at all clear how things were going to turn out. There was reason to fear that the Soviets under Stalin would press their conquests forward into Central and Western Europe and down to the Mediterranean. An enfeebled Europe looked like easy prey. In fact, though, Russia's conquests during 1945 stopped on her eastern borderlands, where she annexed the Baltic states, large chunks of Germany and Poland, and where she set up a string of vassal states from Poland to the Balkans. Germany itself, divided and occupied after 1945, furnished one of these vassal states in its eastern portion, while the Allied zone of occupation in the west became a democratic federal republic in due course. The way Europe was divided after the war reproduced patterns that had been set 1,000 years before. If you look at the map, you can see how much non-communist Europe has in common with the Roman Empire and the Carolingian Empire, and how largely the communist empire, especially where it runs through Germany, coincides with the areas that Western Christianity and the Western tradition left untouched for a long time. After the war, Germany became a main stage for Russian probes and Western resistance, especially in Berlin. Although the city had been divided among the victors after the war like the rest of Germany, Berlin was located 100 miles within Russia's occupied German zone. This marked the city as a permanent sore and one the communists could scratch whenever they wanted. The Berlin airlift of 1948 and 49 came about when the Russians closed land access to the city, hoping to force the French, British and Americans out. It didn't work. Supplies were brought in by plane, tens of thousands of flights, but the crisis was not the first nor the last there and elsewhere. Berlin was only one point where the friction turned to crisis, where constant communist probing forced Western countermeasures. It was an entirely new situation, neither peace nor war, but a worldwide struggle in which every possible weapon was used short of the direct confrontation that might lead to atomic warfare. In a speech in 1947, Bernard Baruch, the American financier, gave it a name, the Cold War. In the 19th century, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville had seen the future of the world divided between Americans and Russians, one side standing for liberty, the other for servitude. Now, the almost pathological hostility between the two camps rose to more fantastic heights than when the Bolsheviks had seized power in 1917. Within a few years, each side had learned to look upon the other as the incarnation of evil. But even this unpleasant situation wasn't entirely useless, as we shall see. After 1945, the impoverished remnants of West European power could not maintain a Cold War on their own. That was something only the Americans could do, and they started to do so in 1947 to help Greece and Turkey, then under heavy pressure from the communists.
I present to you at this time.
On March 12th of that year, President Truman went before Congress to ask for aid and to enunciate what came to be called the Truman Doctrine.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
Whether you think the Truman Doctrine is noble or foolhardy or something in between, it has colored American foreign policy ever since, from Greece to Vietnam to Nicaragua. But back in 1948, it could not prevent a communist coup in Czechoslovakia, the last country in Eastern Europe to have preserved its independence. The rape of Czechoslovakia, a fragile democracy violated twice in a decade, first by Hitler, then by Stalin, this followed quickly by the blockade of Berlin, made 1948 a very uneasy year. So, as a first step in their own defense, Britain, France and the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, signed a defensive treaty out of which NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was to grow. Ironically, the great power clash which had been expected and feared in Europe broke out at the other end of the world when the Russian-trained troops of North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. Korea was another country divided between communist and allied occupation zones. And the war the United Nations fought there, the war to keep Korea divided rather than let the northern communists take the lot, lasted 3 years. It brought in the Chinese. It saw General Douglas MacArthur advocating the invasion of China and possibly the start of World War III, until Truman brought him home. The war cost some 3 million casualties among the military and civilian populations involved, including about 140,000 Americans. In Europe, one effect of the Korean War was the feeling that NATO could only work properly if Germany was armed and integrated into the military alliance of the democracies that had beaten her. So by 1955, Germany had become a full-fledged member of the treaty organization only 10 years after her defeat. But this military build-up was not the only tactic the West used. It was apparent that the communists did best where economic and social dislocation on a major scale wore down the middle class and made workers miserable, creating social grievances that the communists could use. The anti-communists, therefore, had to make war on poverty, unemployment, hunger and inflation. In June 1947, the U.S. Secretary of State, General George C. Marshall, announced a new policy directed, he said, not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy.
It menaces no one.
Well, it doesn't always happen, but the Marshall Plan worked as planned. The actual financial aid that it provided, equivalent to about $60 billion in 1987 terms, was somewhat less than the American aid which Europe had received from 1945 to the time it started. But previous aid had been distributed haphazardly. This new aid was going to be coordinated by Europeans themselves. Indeed, the greatest function of the Marshall Plan was to promote European cooperation in the establishment of a common recovery program, which by 1951 brought industrial output back to pre-war levels. With a series of international agreements, Western Europe tried to leave behind the conflicts of national claims and ambitions which had shaped it and scarred it over the past century and a half. And it moved towards political and economic integration managed by supranational institutions. It's unlikely that this would have happened without the original American initiative. Or, one would think, without the stubborn policy of Stalin, who was determined to keep his part of Europe out of it. And so the advance of West European integration and the advance of communist policy developed in a kind of counterpoint. The Marshall Plan was a counter to communist advances. And the answer to this Western aid was a tightening of Stalinist reins on Eastern satellites, culminating in the loss of Czech independence in 1948. The struggle over Berlin in that same year encouraged the creation of NATO, and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 hastened the emancipation of West Germany, whose manpower and resources could not be spared, which in turn led to the sovereignty of the rival German Democratic Republic in the East and to the creation of the Warsaw Pact to reinforce Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the German resurgence prompted the pooling of coal and steel resources of Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, France, and Germany in the European coal and steel community in order to restrain and control German economic activity. And that led to the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957, which established a common market in Western Europe with common tariffs, ensuring the free movement of capital, labor, and goods, and working out common social and economic policies. You know that it's a classic rule that unification provides a vaster market and broader opportunities, not only for trade, but for planning on a more economical scale. By 1960, even though European economic unification was still grudging, incomplete, hesitant, the consumption, productivity, and living standards of people living in Western Europe were double what they had been before the war. Western Europe had 3% of the land and 10% of the population of the world, but it had 20% of its food, 25% of its total output, 40% of world trade. By 1973, the average European consumed more than twice as much as he had done in 1950. Some denounced this as crass consumerism. Most regarded it as a distinct improvement. A lot more people had proper homes to live in, refrigerators, even cars. They lived better, they ate better, and as a result, the generations that grew up in the 50s and 60s were a good deal taller than their parents. One thing this meant was that very few people remained who had nothing to lose, as their parents had had nothing to lose in the Depression. They now had a stake in society. They wanted to see it continue changing for the better. And they didn't want to change it radically, let alone destroy it, or see it destroyed. But while this European miracle was the doing of Europeans, with a little help from their friends, the preservation of the miracle in the West continued to be regarded as somebody else's business. Just as in the 1930s, the European democracies did not want to make the effort, did not want to spend the money or to draft their young people to ensure their own defense. And this is not very surprising. Sensible people, free people, prefer to invest in present needs and comforts rather than in hypothetical future threats. For the economy, this attitude is very practical. The United States built up its economy in the 19th century with hardly an army and not much of a navy, which left a lot more resources for productive investment. And West Germany and Japan have now joined the United States as the world's greatest economic powers because they spend so little on defense. So this is the reasonable way to act. But it's only the reasonable way if you have somebody who will shoulder the burden for you and keep you safe. And in the second half of the 20th century, that someone is the United States.
So the defense of Western Europe was left in large part to the Americans. And since most Europeans weren't going to provide sufficient men and money to safeguard themselves, the deterrent was provided by atomic weaponry. Inferiority in conventional forces was compensated by atomic defense. In effect, NATO was saying to the Soviets and to Eastern Europe, if you attack us with infantry and tanks and planes, we shall be forced to use our atom bombs. This has worked well enough, except that a lot of people in Europe now feel caught between the two superpowers, and they seem to have forgotten the history of nuclear deterrence, the fact that nuclear weapons were far cheaper in the first place than the conventional forces that no one in the West wanted to pay for. Meanwhile, the Cold War was redefining the meaning of the West as that part of the world where Soviet writ did not run. So the West, meaning us, included Turkey but not Czechoslovakia, Israel but not Hungary, Japan but not Cuba. The political systems of these so-called Western nations vary widely, of course, but in all of them the capitalist system was being steadily modified to include elements of socialism and social welfare programs, forms of economic organization more traditionally associated with their communist rivals. And while the Western world moved ever further away from the capitalist model that Marx and Lenin described, the Soviet world moved closer to the kind of old regime it claimed to replace, complete with police control, intellectual control, militarism, and nationalism.
And so the combination of nationalism and socialism, albeit in very different forms, this combination has been reincarnated in communist regimes and to some extent in capitalist regimes just a few decades after the defeat of Germany. But the places where it has flourished most are in the so-called Third World. It's never been clear to me where the Second World is situated, but let's say so. In the countries that have sprung up on the ruins of the West's old colonies, nationalism and socialism combine. And we'll take a look at these countries and their European legacy in our next program. Until then. The non-industrial countries of the world used to be backward but self-sufficient. Now they are backward and dependent, with every baby born pushing them closer to catastrophe. The third world, this time on the Western tradition.
Last time we ended on a note of turnabout. In the second half of the 20th century, the capitalist West was becoming more socialist. The Soviet world was becoming more like the old Tsarist regime it was meant to replace, and there was even a resurgence of National Socialism, especially in the former colonies of the West. One of the great novelties of the post-war era has been the appearance and the progressive self-assertion of this so-called Third World, born of the dissolution of Europe's colonial empires. More than 50 new republics have joined the ranks of the United Nations since 1945. By 1974, the only colonial empire left to Europe was that of Russia. The current colonial holdings of France or Britain are scarcely worth mention in comparison with those of countries like China, South Africa, Indonesia, or even the Sudan. Europe's age of territorial imperialism seems to be over, and that itself is a remarkable change.
But the colonial enterprises of the past have left their mark behind them. Whether they came to heal, teach, order, or exploit, the Europeans were bound to revolutionize when they did not destroy the societies, peoples, cultures that they touched. But whatever motives moved the European empire builders, they were responsible for training the leaders and inspiring the ideologies that have challenged Westerners and then displaced them. On the one hand, the need of the industrialized nations to interfere with those less developed, as England did with India, this need increased as communications shrank the world and trade tied its disparate parts together. Without the colonies' markets, and especially their products, the industries of the West were likely to run down. On the other hand, more backward countries could only hope to match their exploiters in wealth and power by developing capital, skills, value systems from the West. That is, by facilitating even greater foreign meddling in and control of their affairs. The West could not be kept out without Western techniques. And those techniques could not be acquired without bringing in the West. That was the quandary.
But some actions of the West, even if they were intended to be benevolent, could have dire effects if they were based on an inappropriate estimate of what was good. Condensed milk for babies, solid meals for starving men and women, cold water for the overheated, these can hurt or kill. Similarly, so can constitutions and other alien imports. You cannot introduce machines and factories without implicit concepts of what man can or should do. You cannot introduce social services without attendant ideas of what man needs and what man is. One materialism ushers in another. One ideology elbows out another and imposes itself.
European ideas concerning property, for instance, proved as much a dissolvent to third world cultures as European arms and techniques. When lands which had been held and worked in common were split up and treated as private, separate pieces of property subject to sale, transfer, mortgage by one particular owner, then tribal or communal forms of land tenure were dissolved, and with them the societies, the crafts, the tribes which had evolved structures quite different from those of the West. Like land, labor also had to be brought in line with European concepts and European needs. Older forms of labor organization were replaced, sometimes forcibly, by money wages, open markets, regular hours, above all by the notion of work as an ethical value rather than merely a demanding necessity. Where Europe took 500 years to live the evolution from Middle Ages to modern world, African and Asian societies were forced to live it in a couple of generations. Money replaced barter or subsistence. Exchange replaced self-sufficiency. Tens of millions who had seldom or never used currency were initiated into its delights or pressured by taxes and other obligations into cash-producing activities. Efficiency replaced haphazardness. Secularization replaced traditional magic observances. Laws and administration replaced custom. Impersonal bureaucracies replaced face-to-face relationships. Some of this was an improvement, all of it was upsetting. One society after another was affected by alien concepts generally applied with little understanding of the historical background or the stability provided by existing practices. People who had operated time out of mind as parts of customary cultures were introduced to the possibilities and the insecurities of change. They really could not challenge their new masters. But the colonial process is not as simple as it is often painted, and it does not operate in one direction alone. The occupier does not simply rule the occupied, he infiltrates their consciousness, their lives, their culture. He takes hold of them inside and out. Indians and Nigerians often want to be English gentlemen. All this indicates the possibility that technological society did not destroy values as such, but rather suggested new values. What you see in 19th and 20th century colonial history is an accelerated version of European history. Contract replaced tradition. The free-moving, free-wheeling individual replaced the static family or tribe. Democracy, with all its drawbacks and opportunities, replaced the stable hierarchies of status and birth. Changing legal structures transformed society and social attitudes. Technological innovations turned congeries of provinces into countries, spread modern skills, suggested the revival of native industry and enterprise in a new guise and on a new scale. And just as in Europe, all this has provided more efficient modern means for age-old tendencies to exploit, to oppress, and to murder your enemies en masse. But because the whole world is at our doorstep, we can see that time has not unraveled at the same rate for people in every country. We are haunted by the disparity between the advanced countries and all others, the imbalance between the industrialized West and North and the agrarian remainder of the world. Today, a glance across the world reveals extraordinary differences. Unlike 200 years ago, when generally speaking, most people everywhere still lived approximately in similar circumstances. Today's differences are more on a scale of time than space. Behind this lies the fact that while all the world advances, its most advanced areas advance the fastest. Europe and North America, which have less than 30% of the world's population, produce 80% of its income. And Europe continues to consume the greatest share of the surplus foods and raw materials of the world, and to provide the leading exporters of manufactured goods, just as she had done in 1900. Asia, Africa, Latin America are increasing their production too, but not nearly as fast. And they are not making lots of money from selling raw materials to Europe either, because a great change, another great change, has occurred. The largest amount of trading takes place between the industrial nations themselves instead of between the industrial nations and their former colonies. Europe and the United States take less of the world's raw materials now than they did 70 years ago. So primary producers in Asia, in Africa, in South America, with their rubber and their oil and their tin, do less trade. And they do it on worse terms than before because demand for their products is shrinking or is only being maintained by artificial means. A country like Ghana produced more cocoa in 1964 than it did in 1954, but it earned less than half what it had earned a decade before. And since the 1973 oil crisis, the situation has only grown worse. In 1970, the beef from one African cow could pay for 1 barrel of oil. Now it takes 8 cows to buy a barrel of oil. Non-industrial economies used to be backward, but self-sufficient. Now they are backward and dependent, which makes them more unstable than the industrial economies on which they depend. That is especially true when a country depends on a single product. All in all, over a score of countries still depend on a single product for over half of their export trade, and they lead a precarious existence, teetering on the brink of catastrophe with every oscillation of world commodity prices. At the same time, these economies have been caught between soaring demand for modern goods and insufficient supply. The result has been crippling inflation. Between 1958 and 1968, the cost of living index went up from 100 to 149 in India, 202 in Ghana, 879 in Argentina, 2,260 in Brazil, all countries where anachronism and modernization are at odds.
In my first lecture, I quoted Voltaire about history being only a pack of tricks that we play on the dead. How often, one may ask, is history a pack of tricks that the dead play on us and we play on each other? And we become aware of them as one hidden mine after another goes off unexpectedly under our feet. Overpopulation might be one of history's most fiendish tricks.
Modern sanitation techniques and disease control had such a dramatic effect on underdeveloped nations that the population growth which occurred over several centuries in the West took less than a decade in certain Asian and South American countries, far faster than the economy and means of production could adjust to the conditions this created. The continents least able to bear it find their population rising fastest. Asia, with 50% of the world's population, has 11% of its revenues. Men and women have multiplied for thousands of years to reach the 5 billion mark. Short of catastrophe, they'll double that in 40 years. And yet most of these masses, who are no longer powerless or silent, who grow in number because of the West's medical advances, cannot afford the West's comforts, machinery, or nourishment. Discontent can spread more rapidly than prosperity. As Nehru once remarked, what is new in India is not misery, but the consciousness the Indian people has of it today and its impatience to be free of it. Yet, whilst an American farmer can feed 44 persons, a Frenchman 12, a Russian 5, the average producer in an undeveloped country can generally feed only himself properly, at best one other person. It takes 15 Indian cows to give as much milk as one American cow, 7 acres of Vietnamese rice paddy to harvest the same quantities as those produced by 1 acre in Australia.
Unfortunately, there's little reason to think that the hungry countries, whose population by 2000 AD will be over 5 billion, 4/5 of the total projected for the whole planet, that these countries can be modernized fast enough to keep them from becoming a miserable, suffering, explosive sore. The greater the population, the less likely their living standard is to improve. The less the living standard improves, the less chance there is of lowering the birth rate. The greater the population pressure on available resources, the fewer resources can be spared to increase productivity, to improve living conditions, and to create possibilities and attitudes conducive to limiting the population.
The area of the world's cultivated lands can be tripled, productivity greatly intensified. A fuller, more balanced diet might even cut down the population growth. Recent studies suggest that hungry societies whose diet is deficient in proteins may be particularly prolific, while protein-rich diets reduce the fertility rate. It's also possible to bring the birth rate down to compensate for a lower death rate, and it is possible to enlist science in solving the problems of subsistence, production, and population. But capital and technology depend on human attitudes and human decisions. In this regard, the 1980s have witnessed remarkable strides in India and China, but equally remarkable retrogression in other places. 30 years after colonial rule, African states are more dependent than ever on foreign assistance. Every fifth sack of grain the Africans will eat is imported. So are the armaments, which account for far more money than goes to their living standards. As usual, political decisions command material possibilities. Cultural and ideological orientation affects and directs the uses of the means at society's command. And so, while the hungry and backward countries challenge the industrialized West to aid them even more, they also accuse it of ignoring or destroying their peculiar culture and their values. The aid has become both problem and solution. It condemns as it saves. The story of the Third World also emphasizes something else, the sheer brevity of colonial imperialism. In the last 3 centuries, Europeans conquered much of the world. They settled it. They set their mark on it with their culture and technology, but they didn't need colonies to do this. And the colonial age was a very brief episode in the history of the West. Colonies, remember, were a very uneconomic way of exploiting people. But even this brief interlude had a dramatic, often devastating effect on the Third World, which had barely changed for thousands of years. As for the West, much of what happened in the last 100 years has proved as short-lived as the colonial age. Much is being abandoned, much is being reversed. Literacy, for example, which was so hard to achieve and only generalized around 1900, literacy is now seeping away. We're returning to the oral and visual culture of our forefathers. Law and order that proved so hard to establish are also cracking. Life used to be precarious, then it became a little less precarious in the late 19th century. In the late 20th century, it grows more precarious again. And while material uniformity grows, cultural uniformity, another recent achievement, cultural uniformity wanes. Even national unity is being challenged by particularisms reasserted. Linguistic in Belgium or Canada, national in Brittany and Wales and Catalonia and Yugoslavia, cultural and ethnic in countries like the United States. The long trend to greater centralization, to greater authority, is being reversed in the West, although of course not in the rest of the world. And the shorter trend, which for 3 or 4 centuries tried to impose standards of reason and rational discourse, this is meeting strong competition from the sciences, the arts, and the politics of irrationality. It's hard, after all, to be rational in an irrational world. It is not rational. So we're going back to earlier situations which our forefathers fought hard to alter and overcome. And whatever else this means, it suggests that historical experience is not a linear progression, it's rather a meander, a river in whose waters you can never step twice, of course, but also one whose curves ever approach each other and ever flow through new, unexpected territory. Next time, the technological revolution. Until then. From hot air balloons and bicycles to airplanes and motor cars, not to mention radios, telephones, mass circulation newspapers, and cinema, and television, the world was getting smaller. It turned faster. It became more self-conscious each day. The technological revolution, this time on the Western tradition. We're almost ready to conclude our 5,000 years of history, our economy tour through the old country. Although there really is no conclusion, there is no happy ending, there is no eternal damnation, there is no priceless wisdom even, just a little more experience. The human predicament remains essentially the same, but we live it in greater comfort. And that's what I want to remind you of in our last two programs, just how far we've come in material terms at least, if not in any other. At 4 p.m. on April 24, 1900, a balloon rose from the Tuileries Gardens in Paris, while 15,000 people craned their necks to watch. On board the balloon was a pioneer cinematographer, the cinema having been invented 5 or 6 years before. As he went up, he writes, a light wind pushed us eastward. It's from 400 meters that Paris looks its best. Knotted around a ribbon of the Seine, one saw it all, cut up by avenues and boulevards, gullied by its streets and lanes. Since that time, aviation has got us used to this sort of sight. In 1900, it was completely new. You would think that could have happened sooner, since the hot air balloon used in 1900 was an invention of the 18th century. But balloons remained a rare curiosity, while airplanes, when they came, multiplied fast. Within 3 years of 1903, when the Wright brothers got the first airplane off the ground, an aircraft factory in the Paris suburb of Billancourt was turning out good biplanes. By 1908, one of these had made the first cross-country flight in Europe, 27 kilometers, about 15 miles, from Bouilly to Reims in the Champagne. The following year, Louis Blériot would cross the English Channel with no compass by following the ships that steamed between Boulogne and Dover. But then, in 1909, aerial photographs were taken of military installations in northeastern France. And in that same year, 38 airplanes entered the first air meeting held at Reims in the Champagne. Now, this had been organized by the local champagne industry. It offered considerable prizes and it set several records, but the Reims meeting didn't just reflect the publicity value of the new machines, it also suggested their military potential. This was soon demonstrated when in 1911 the Italians, at war with the Turks, began to use planes to scout out enemy positions and also to chuck out bombs by hand. John Galsworthy, the English novelist, wrote a moving letter to the London Times begging the military to leave us the innocence of the air. But the air was destined to be violated like the rest of the earth. Within a couple of years, British troops were being equipped with specially built anti-aircraft guns. And things have never been quite the same since.
As we have seen, wars serve as great accelerators. The end of the war in 1918 left lots of useless planes and lots of unemployed pilots. It didn't take long for some of these to start to fly both passengers and mail. 5 years later, flying aces back from World War I offered promenades in the air and also 2-hour flights to and from Paris. By the 1930s, anyone who could afford it could travel or ship goods across the world on regular services. Still, passenger flying remained the prerogative of kings like Edward VIII, dictators, and other exceptional figures until World War II accelerated things once more and turned the luxury of the few into the commonplace transport of the many. Jet engines developed for late model fighter planes and for Hitler's V-1, the Vengeance planes, revealed commercial possibilities. In 1952, BOAC, the British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, introduced the first passenger jet service. By the 1960s, wide-bodied jumbo jets were carrying 600 and 700 passengers. In 1976, the supersonic Concorde, costly triumph for Franco-British engineering, crossed the Atlantic in less than 3 hours. Lindbergh in 1927 took 10 times as long and had to wait for his champagne. Now, if you're flying from Paris to New York, you can get there before you've left. It was impressive to know that men could fly to the moon, but simple commercial flight added a new dimension to the experience of ordinary folk. Now they could cross entire continents with greater speed and ease than it had taken to get from a country town to the capital 100 years before. Jaded as we are today, we might want to give a moment's thought to how and from what all this started. The true origins of heavier-than-air flying machines lie less in the fantasies of Leonardo da Vinci than in humbler and more practical aspirations. In 1889, an Irishman named John Boyd Dunlop, soon followed by the Michelin brothers of France, patented a kind of rubber tire that turned unwieldy, uncomfortable velocipedes into bicycles, safer, easier to ride and control, and soon much cheaper as well. For the first time in history, man found an alternative to the costly horse, one that permitted him to move much faster than he could do on foot. And woman discovered an emancipating agent, liberating her from constricting corsets, voluminous skirts, and chaperones. As the 19th century ended, as the 20th century began, manufacturers of corset stays and umbrella spokes turned to making bicycles, with such effect that prices dropped within a decade or two to where quite modest folk could afford to buy one. Others, more venturesome, equipped the new contraptions with steam or petrol engines, turning bi, tri, or quadricycles first into motorbikes, then into motor cars, then into flying machines. All of them used much the same parts,
and most were produced and raced by the same men and women who were driven by love of gain, but also, and above all, by the spirits of enterprise and adventure, the love of excitement and speed that marks a century not half as mopey as it is sometimes made out. At first, however, the bicycle remained the people's horse. A horse that consumed no hay, required no stable, dropped no manure. Cars took a bit longer. Motorized public transport dates to the beginning of the century, and its appearance drove a British scholar to stately complaint. What is this that roareth thus? Can it be a motor bus? Yes, the smell and hideous hum indicat motorem bum. How shall wretches live like us, cincto bis motoribus? Domine defende nos contra hos motores bos. Oh, you don't have to understand Latin to know exactly how he felt. In Europe, low-priced cars for the middle classes didn't come until the 1930s, when men like André Citroën adopted and adapted Henry Ford's assembly line methods. Then in 1938, Ferdinand Porsche turned out the first people's car, the Volkswagen, prototype of a post-war family of Morris Minors and Citroën 2-horsepower cars that made automobiles accessible to most. By 1960, there was one private car for every 31 people in the world, one for 3 in the United States, one for 22 in Europe. Predictably, bikes and motorcars also led to more tourist facilities. Inns, restaurants, hotels that now cater to more than just commercial travelers, and they also led to better roads. Rutted, dusty, ill-paved highways were gradually replaced by even surfaces kinder to tires and springs. In 1924, the first high-speed autostrada opened in Italy between Varese and Milan. Italy and Germany pioneered the freeways that the United States was going to perfect. And so Europe and the world moved from the age of animal and foot power to that of motor traction. In 1914, the floods of refugees had pushed hand-barrows or trudged along their horse carts. In 1940, similar refugees filled highways with bikes and cars, fleeing from German tanks, dive-bombed by screaming aircraft. There was no holding back progress. Other goodies were born quite literally with the century. The cheap box camera in 1900, vacuum cleaners in 1901, and also gramophone records. People had made their own music or listened to somebody playing it in a hall or in a public kiosk. Now they could listen to music at will. By 1913, Decca had devised a portable gramophone that could be used in the garden or taken on picnics, and that didn't cost more than a Sunday lunch. Soon, that would prove a boon in the trenches. In 1901, an Italian, Guglielmo Marconi, also achieved the first wireless communication across the Atlantic. By 1912, when the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic with 1,600 souls, the miraculous possibilities of modern technology sending out distress signals were revealed along with the fragility of modern technology. Parisians had been talking about pulling down the Eiffel Tower, which had been denounced as an eyesore since 1889. but a radio antenna on top of the tower's 1,000-foot structure ensured its survival. Then, in 1920, Marconi opened the first British broadcasting station near Chelmsford in Essex, soon to become the BBC. Soon also, families would be free from oppressive silences. They could switch on the radio. And after the Second World War, television, which had been demonstrated back in 1926. By 1933, President Roosevelt's fireside chats would demonstrate the political uses of mass communications, and soon Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, Hitler, Churchill would take up the idea. The world was shrinking. More people were traveling and traveling faster. Where the Black Plague of the 14th century had taken months and months to spread through Europe, the flu of 1918 took only a few weeks. At the same time, radios and telephones, another 19th century invention perfected in the 20th, and mass circulation papers and magazines were making the world ever smaller, more stressful, more conscious of what went on next door and beyond. 20th century men and women wake up and go to bed with news from near and far, and since good news is seldom news, the diet of sensationalism makes for indigestion or at least flatulence. Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, lambasted Britain's press lords for wanting power without responsibility, which he described as the prerogative of the harlot through the ages. But the press was far more influential than prostitutes ever were, something Macaulay had predicted in 1828 when he dubbed its reporters the Fourth Estate. And most of the media's power came not from the opinions they expressed, but from the information they conveyed almost unconsciously, information about possibilities, about ways of life and standards and acceptabilities and availabilities that much of the world, whether in far continents or poor streets right here at home, most of the world had long ignored, and that it gradually set to copy. I remember in 1944 seeing the film Mrs. Miniver in an open-air cinema in India. The Indians were watching from the wall and from the trees outside. And I wondered, sitting in that privileged enclosure, looking at the images of such a privileged life, I wondered what the Indians made of the dresses and manners and comforts in the film, so alien to them then, so commonplace by now, 40 years later. And then there was advertising. The 19th century had seen an explosion of publicity, posters, displays that livened city streets. In 1910, the first neon tube was demonstrated in Paris, and it proved ideally suited not just for streetlights, but for advertising too. In 1912, the first neon advertisements went up in Paris for an Italian aperitif, Cinzano. Lights, prints, images, newspapers and reviews, radio and cinema, then television, spurred a revolution of aspirations, the like of which the world had never seen. Modern technology was busy producing ever more things to covet, and modern technology in due course fulfilled many of the aspirations it inspired. More than by its wars, the 20th century stands out by the radical physical difference between its way of life and that of all preceding centuries. The world probably changed no more between the birth of Jesus and 1900 than it has changed from 1900 to the present. And while not all the novelties of our time were devised after 1900, all have been developed and made generally available during the 80 years just past, especially the last 20. And this is as true of neon as of other new devices. Sidewalks and sewers, streetlights and paving, bathrooms and water closets, running water beyond the ground floor, let alone hot and cold running water, gas and electric ranges, all of these were exceptional luxuries before the First World War. Bakelite was invented by a Belgian in 1907, but it wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that plastic objects, furniture, and containers revolutionized industrial design. Telephones were also rare in Europe until after the war. The first dial telephone, the first automatic exchange in Britain, appeared in 1920. And even though the first domestic electrical refrigerator went on sale in Chicago in 1913, milk still turned in summer, and meat still went bad for lack of refrigeration in European homes and shops of the 1950s and 60s. It was not until the last 20 years, at most 30, that most Europeans lived the crucial transformation of their homes and kitchens in lighting, heating, ease of movement and labor-saving devices, in stoves and ovens with thermostats that didn't have to be watched all the time, in refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, even self-wringing mops. It was the women who benefited most from these improvements, so that one must suppose critics of labor-saving devices to be mostly curmudgeons of the male sex. And it is another point in our century's favor that it saw great strides in the emancipation of half of the human race. The work performed by women became less demanding. Their dress became less constricting as elastic rubber replaced whalebone and lacing in foundation garments around 1905, as bras shortened the corset around 1914, as skirts lightened and rose after 1917. Even beautification was democratized when lipsticks in disposable metal cartridges appeared in 1915, but far more so by the appearance of artificial silk fibers in 1910 and then nylon stockings in 1939, which inspired immortal lines that I quote from memory. When as in silk my Julia goes that is composed of cellulose, the fibers of her garb and hose, designed for her by jewels and sea, oh, how her beauty fetches me. But the fundamental emancipator of women, long yearned for, really came in 1956 with the marketing of the first oral contraceptive. The pill was far from perfect, but it was more important than the vote because it promised choice and the potential emancipation of womankind from its biological destiny. No small thing. Now, of course, women are not alone in being subject to a biological condition.
And in this realm, all mankind has undergone a revolution undreamt of in earlier times, partial reprieve from biological destiny. In our next program, we shall learn more about that and other breakthroughs of the 20th century, as well as some of the century's keenest disappointments. Until then. One after another, the laws of physics have been rewritten, the theories of life itself revised. As science and technology radically change our lives for better and for worse, we are reminded once more that in much wisdom there is grief. Toward the future, this time on the Western tradition. Last time we saw how modern technology made everyday life easier for normal people, easier than it had ever been before. But there was another even greater revolution in the 20th century, one that has granted humanity a partial reprieve from biological destiny. It was in 1901, for example, that the first Nobel Prizes were awarded. The prize for physics went to Wilhelm Röntgen for his work on X-rays, which some at that time still regarded as a curiosity, no different from moving pictures or balloon ascents. And the prize for medicine that year went to Emil von Behring for his work on diphtheria. Both awards illustrated the spectacular advances being made in medicine, which the 20th century was going to carry still further. In 1899, 100,000 people in England and Wales alone died of infectious diseases. But in our century, vaccination, inoculation, preventive medicine, preventive hygiene would make such swathes of infection obsolete. They cut back tuberculosis. They obliterated smallpox, which had been the scourge of mankind. 200 years ago, 9 Europeans in 10 contracted smallpox, 1 in 7 died from it, most of the rest were left more or less disfigured. By mid-20th century, this plague was a memory, along with cholera, whooping cough, diphtheria, and after 1954, polio. Our major diseases today go with living longer, like cancer, and living more stressfully, like heart disease. Even AIDS is a gift of better communications and world travel, as syphilis was in the 16th century. Some plagues simply took longer before they disappeared. The transmission of typhus from man to man by lice was discovered in 1909, but the conditions in which this took place couldn't be so easily eliminated. During the First World War, for instance, most Serbian deaths came not from battle, but from typhus. Between 1917 and 1921, the disease hit some 25 million in Soviet territories, and it caused 3 million deaths. As famine, misery, and filth receded, so did typhus. The fight against disease was becoming a fight against conditions that would breed disease. Malarial marshes, mosquitoes, malnutrition, dirt. But the fight was also aided by the development of more and more effective drugs, serums, antibiotics, which were much speeded up by the 2 world wars. No less important was general public access to medical care, something extremely rare 100 years ago, when most people could not afford a doctor and one only went to hospital to die. With medical care, mortality declined precipitously, longevity soared. But since nothing is ever clear-cut,
The progress of modern medicine and public health brought new problems in its wake. The declining death rate resulted in a huge population increase. Despite dramatically improved crop yields and productivity, due in good part to the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers turned out by a German chemist in 1910, there wasn't enough food to feed all the new people. Although it was more evident in undeveloped countries where hunger and government incompetence and thievery continued as a way of life, the problem was also beginning to be recognized even in the wealthier West. The demographic bomb, however, caused less concern than bombs of other kinds. The summer of 1945 saw the first explosions of controlled atomic devices that could release vast power, whether for good or ill. Accelerated as usual by war, this came as the culmination of research in physics that had been going on since the beginning of the century in Europe. Around 1911, the work of the Curies in France and of Rutherford in England revealed the instability and disintegration of atoms in radioactive substances.
No longer any doubt about it. That uranium is splitting into at least two big parts, and those biggest kicks, nearly 100 million electrons,
which had been believed to be the firm, indivisible base of the material world, atoms could now be split, releasing energy in the process. It was a fundamental tenet of classic theories that light, energy, and matter were both continuous and separate entities. But now, work done in Germany, Denmark, Switzerland, Italy suggested that when bodies emit light, they actually radiate energy pulsating in infinitesimal measures, quanta, proportional to the frequency of a discontinuous radiation. One after the other, the solid notions that paved the floor of science appeared to melt away. A new physics was suggesting new hypotheses about the structure of the universe, of matter, of perception. Picasso's Cubism, Dali's Surrealism reflected this in painting and in sculpture. Freud's emphasis on the unconscious came out in the free association of surrealists and the deliberate, apparent incoherence of someone like James Joyce in literature. The mathematical principles of Isaac Newton, the rationalism, the mechanical determinism of the past 300 years, these were being rewritten into a new relativism. In 1905, Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity suggested that neither time nor space was absolute. There were no absolutes anymore. By 1915, Einstein's general theory of relativity presented matter itself as just one form of energy, and the basic component of matter, the atom, a tiny compound of compressed energy, could turn into light, or into heat, or both. Now, this transmutation of matter into energy, which Rutherford called the new alchemy, this could be set off by bombarding atoms with smaller subatomic particles. In 1932, the first cyclotron was built to accelerate this bombardment, and it was also found that in the case of atoms of certain elements like uranium, their disintegration was accompanied by a chain reaction that went with an intense emission of energy which could be controlled in a nuclear reactor or packaged into a bomb. This was the basis of the 400-pound bomb which destroyed Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945. Hiroshima, like Guernica in the Spanish Civil War, Hiroshima has become part of history and continues to affect it. The justified terror of what atom bombs could do, and far worse devices also, has played its part in avoiding major conflicts over 40 extremely nervous years. But it has also produced a pervasive anxiety and guilt about man's capacity to destroy mankind, and more specifically about the dangers of science and technology. That anxiety was further spurred when, in 1953, at Cambridge again, James Watson and Francis Crick deciphered the double helix configuration of the molecule of DNA, which determines the structure and the function of every living animal or plant, and which functions like a living computer that tells a cell what protein to make. In other words, what to create and how. In 1972, the theory was put to work when scientists in California managed to split and recombine DNA so as to use it for particular purposes. The step from theory to application had taken half a century in nuclear physics. It took less than 20 years to produce man-made microorganisms. Like atoms bombarded by radioactive rays, man's solid certainties disintegrated under the bombardment of physics, chemistry, biochemistry, astronomy, and indeed geography. The Danish physicist Niels Bohr explained this as early as 1938. Man, said Niels Bohr, no longer lives at the center of the universe surrounded by less fortunate societies on the edge of some abyss. Men and women now share a small spherical planet of one solar system, which is only one small part of much larger systems. This, like the revision of our long-held ideas about space and time, said Bohr, provided a forceful admonition about the relativity of all human judgments. So what you have here is a contemporary replay of the Copernican revolution of 300 years ago. And the anxiety that was voiced by the future Dean of St. Paul's, by John Donne, in the 17th century, is our anxiety, as we can hear. Donne complains that new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new, then see that this is crumbled out again to his atomies. It's all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. Now that is done in 1611. But it could just as well be the 1980s, except that it rhymes, which no poetry would do today. In any case, here we are,
in the 20th century, with a lot of people already a bit lonely in a godless world, and now they are denied not only God, but the solid substance of judgments and perceptions. The world had always been disgracefully mismanaged, but now you no longer knew to whom to complain. The answer to this predicament was suggested by a philosopher from France in a lecture of 1945. Jean-Paul Sartre put forward what he described as a new humanism and which he called existentialism. Condemned to freedom and to loneliness, Sartrean man finds that his condition can be transcended by himself alone as he endows life, events, above all himself, with a meaning that he must weave out of his own resources. Looking around at a world in which he finds neither faith nor normative values, Sartre rejects despair for an affirmation arising precisely from despair, but leading to choice, to action, to the creation of one's own destiny. Of course, in our new age of disposable fashions, even philosophies are built to self-destruct. No one today thinks much of existentialism, yet it reflects the practice, if not the principle, of our times. Certainly, even if he does not like it, man continues to recreate his destiny at an accelerated pace. One example of this is the computer, which is simply a high-speed calculator with an electronic memory. During the war, the British built the first electronic computer because they wanted to use it to break enemy codes. The first civilian counterpart of this was unveiled in the United States in 1946. It weighed 30 tons, it filled the space of a two-car garage, and it contained 18,000 vacuum tubes, which failed at the rate of 1 every 7 minutes. By the 1980s, one pea-size silicon chip delivers the same amount of computing power, and any home computer costing $100 or less can outperform what cost $500,000 20 years ago. Computers have radically affected our lives for good or ill and cannot be jettisoned short of catastrophe. So, science and technology have changed the ways of life, but not the nature nor the passions of mankind. After a century spent arguing that problems can be solved by science, by reason, or by acts of will, we have to admit that some problems can't be solved, or that their solution leaves more problems in its wake, something that Ecclesiastes apparently knew a long, long time ago. There are not that many people who read the Bible these days, which is the epitome of wisdom and violence and the high aspirations and the hurtful achievements of mankind. So I cannot tell how many of you have read Ecclesiastes. But this is what the preacher says. For in much wisdom there is much grief. And he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. For who knows what is good for men in this life? Who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? So here in the 3rd century before Christ, the Hebrew sage suggests that all is vanity and vexation of spirit. And I'm sure he wasn't the first to say so. So some things have changed, and other things haven't changed at all. But if we still don't know where we're going, at least we face our predicament, the human predicament, in comfort far greater than Ecclesiastes ever knew. And this is a help. As for the Western tradition, if you perceived such a thing as we proceeded, the most striking thing about the Western tradition is that it is not one, but many. It includes authoritarianism and individualism, personal initiative and centralization, obedience and revolt, faith and questioning, inertia and enterprise, conflict and reconciliation. That's what makes our culture, that's what makes our history so tantalizing, so available for almost any reference you want, a yellow pages of human conduct, of human values. But there are, I think, two constants that you can never miss. One of these is curiosity. The quest that drives some in all times to ask, to search more than most. And the other is ambition, which drives some in all times to press further and to try and achieve more. Really, when you think about it, our patron saint is Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. And on this note, I shall leave you with some lines from Wordsworth. Still glides the stream and shall forever glide. The form remains, the function never dies, while we, the brave, the mighty, and the wise, we men who in our morn of youth defied the elements, must vanish. Be it so. Enough that something from our hands have power to live and act and serve the future hour, and that as toward the silent tomb we go, through love, through hope, and faith's unending dower, we feel that we are greater than we know.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.